Hello everyone, welcome to another ODNT Spotlight interview. My name is Steve DeWinter and I am here with a very interesting author. She is doing contemporary dystopian fantasy thrillers. What a concoction for that is, but I bet you those stories are going to be really awesome and we'll talk to her about that. Her name is Arie Farnam and she's here to promote her series, the Arie series, the first book, The Soul and the Seed, which is out now, as well as books 2 and 3, which were part of the same arc in a trilogy, and then books 4 and 5, with 5, Path of the Betrayer, coming out at the end of October. She's shooting for an October 31st release. We'll talk to her about that as well. But let's go ahead and let's switch on over. Hello, Arie. Welcome to ODNT Spotlight.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're glad to have you here. You're coming to us all the way from Prague.
Yep.
So if everyone sees
the connection stays good.
Yep. So we're hoping the Skype connection stays good. Apparently, there's rumor that there's the international Skype connection's kind of iffy. So we'll get through this interview, and they can have their issue later. All right, so go ahead and tell us a little bit about your Arie series, starting with your first trilogy that you did for it. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about the process of how you came about writing a contemporary dystopian fantasy thriller.
Well, I didn't start out to call it that, but it was one of those ideas that developed over 20 years, and I was always really into high fantasy, the epic fantasy sort of thing as a teenager. And yet I couldn't, for some reason, get my writing and my fiction to wrap around just epic fantasy. And I kept being pushed into this contemporary story that incorporates a lot of things that are from high fantasy. It's basically a story of what if the fact that there's all these legends about people who have kind of pointy ears and look kind of like humans but aren't exactly like humans. And there's legends about this from Ireland to Vietnam to all kinds of different countries. Very divergent cultures. What if there was a good reason for that? I.e., there were such people at some point in the past. And so it started with a premise like that, and also another part of the premise has to do with something that I felt mirrored the way that people relate to each other in when there's social exclusion going on, whether it's at the economic level or at the level of schoolyard bullies or something like that. Right. So the other part of the premise is, okay, why, if there were these elf-looking people, why do they not exist anymore? And so there's some great, powerful entity or group in the world that didn't like them and did away with them at some point in the past. And there's a reason for this, and that's because they control the elites of society, which is this organization I chose to call the Arie Association. They are very secret, but they control everyone, including the IMF and all the major militaries and all things like that. Slight conspiracy theory.
They're the secret power.
Readers find this eerily realistic. And it happened to be that the elf-looking people, who are called the Arie, were immune to the kind of control of emotions that this association used to have influence in the world. And so back in the Middle Ages, they got rid of them. But being magical, not exactly human race, they had magic users who implanted something in the human genome that eventually came together as a reinvigorated line of the Arie. So basically, the Arie turn up in modern times. There's some scientific basis for how this could happen.
Oh, very nice.
Based on genetics theories. Too complicated to explain at the moment. But
that's for another series. This is fantasy.
And,
we just know it's possible.
Yes. Anyway, it is fantasy. It's a what if story. So what if the fact that, there's a 1% of the 1% of the world controls just about everything. We know this is true. What if there was a good reason for this, i.e. they were using some kind of control of people's willpower and emotions to run things. We know that democracy doesn't work quite as well as advertised.
Looks great on
often.
paper.
Yeah, it looks great on paper, but lots of campaign finance shenanigans and so forth and so on. So, we know as a former journalist, I had lots of fodder for this part of it. And then what if, why is it that there's lots of different kinds of dogs? Why aren't there different kinds of people? For crying out loud.
Right.
We don't just have all Cocker Spaniels, and some of them have to be brown and some of them happen to be tan. That's what we have with humans. Why is this? Okay. So for me, as a person who loves epic fantasy, this really seems like a real scientific problem. So I put these two what ifs together, and you get the Here and I series, which is, I don't know what, dystopia sounds like it's future. And at the same time, it's also fantasy, and it's a bit dark and has a lot of elements in it that people consider to be along the lines of thrillers. So that's how it got to be called dystopian fantasy thriller.
Excellent, excellent. So the first 3 books are a complete trilogy arc. And we were talking earlier before the show, as much as you say, you definitely have to read all the books in order. So right now we've got 4 books out, with the 5th book coming out in October. And even though books 4 and 5 break from the original trilogy, all the world building has taken place in the first trilogy. So you definitely need that as a foundation, right?
I tried to make it possible to start with the 4th book, but reviewers have basically overruled me and suggest and recommend that people start with the 1st book. So I bow to the reviewers.
Yeah, it's really challenging when you go and you start a whole new trilogy, because books 4, 5, and 6 you say are going to be a separate trilogy, right?
Yeah, it's a different story arc. It starts with different characters. Some of the original characters from the original trilogy get worked back into it by the 2nd book, but largely it starts with different characters, and it's a different part of the same world. It gets blended back in, and a few things get resolved that weren't entirely resolved from the first trilogy.
Excellent. So that sounds like a really, really good trilogy.
The first 3 books.
Yep. So the first 3 books are a set trilogy, and that her story, the main character story, ends with that one. And do you have any? You said you've got a couple of cliffhangers here and there. What was your reader reactions to a cliffhanger ending?
Generally, the reactions were good. I mean, about the only criticism I've really seen from reviewers, primarily on Goodreads, a few people said they don't like, just on general principle, they just don't like cliffhangers. They didn't comment on this one specifically. They just said, "Oh, it's another book with a cliffhanger. I don't agree with those on general principle." That's what I've heard, but it was a very few number of readers, and I personally like cliffhangers when I'm a reader, so I don't do well with what happens in a lot of series is it seems episodic. It's like the main character gets into trouble and then gets out of trouble and everything seems fine, except it's really not going to be that way. And then they get into trouble again, and it's like, is this main character really very smart? So I don't as a reader do well with those types of series. I was a huge Tolkien fan, and so I just can't, I can't, if I'm going to do a series, I can't completely end the story with each book and then start the main character, kind of stupidly getting back into trouble again.
Right, solving all their problems and then tripping into more problems.
The action and the emotional impacted the series is intense. It's not easy escape from reality type of fantasy. A lot of people say they're into fantasy primarily to escape from reality. A lot of people, when they read this, they say this makes me think differently about reality, and
Right.
so it's very intense. And it would be disingenuous to have the character get into this much emotional intensity and then do it again, for some silly reason.
Right. So we're talking about characters. What makes your characters stand out?
All of them, or the main character?
Let's start with the main character, and then we'll hit on some of your other characters that you have, because it's all more than just the one, I'm sure.
Yeah. There's several significant characters in the story. The main character stands out primarily because she is someone who thinks critically about the world at the age of 16. It's not exactly a young adult story, even though it starts with a 16-year-old. She gets older. But she's the kind of person who doesn't entirely fit in to the mold. She doesn't think of herself necessarily as an outsider, but she doesn't entirely fit into the mold. And yet she doesn't let that make her depressed in some way. And so that's a big part of her character. She also, when she gets knocked down, she bounces back fairly quickly. And her impulse is to work on protecting others in a similar sort of situation. So while she comes from a rural backwater, she has some significant spirit to her. And readers tend to really like the main character, which I was very happy about.
Oh, good. That's always a positive thing.
Yeah. You can never be very sure of it. Main characters, for me, have to be so close to the reader that it's harder in some ways to make them stand out. And I was glad that this worked with this character. I write from first person from different perspectives, which is also something that is not particularly common. So the first book has 3 different narrators that are always separated by chapters so that the reader doesn't get confused. Haven't had a lot of problems with people getting confused. But it's always in first person, but it switches to different narrators. There's 3 different narrators. One of them is the main character, and then there's 2 other significant characters. And the other characters who are main characters who are major characters in the story come from different parts of the world, and they're in a significantly different situation from her. Unlike the main character, Aranka, the other 2 primary characters in The Soul and the Seed know what's going on. They know about the fact that there's this association that controls the elites of the world. One of them is a young Israeli doctor, and one of them is a Vietnamese kind of rebel fighter who's part of a pagan religion that is important to the story.
So you've got a lot of diversity in your whole cast.
Yeah. This came out of kind of my teenage fantasy. The characters specifically came out of my teenage fantasies, where I had this group of people who came from these different countries, and I left them the same way that I, for whatever reason, developed them at 14 or 15 years old. I did leave what countries they were from, and primarily what their characters were intact for the past 20 years of story development. I thought, should I change this? This was a stupid teenage idea. But I made it work, and I think it was actually a very good thing. And it makes a much more adult story, actually, which is interesting. But for whatever reason, I had a Vietnamese character, an Israeli character, an Arab character, a Russian character, an Australian character, a Kenyan character, and a Czech character.
You've got them all.
Yeah, I guess the Czech character was not Czech necessarily back when I was a teenager. I didn't really know about the Czech Republic back then till I was 16. It was one of the later editions.
Excellent. So you've been working on this story since high school and beyond. When did you first come up with the idea for this story?
Well, as I said, the characters I came up with very early on as a teenager. But the story has developed a lot beyond that time. It took, 20 years to develop most of the major ideas until I was ready to write it into a story. And for a long time, I thought it was too silly. I thought it was too strange because it didn't fit in, as you said before, it didn't fit into any of the fantasy genres. It wasn't exactly science fiction. It wasn't exactly thriller. It wasn't exactly fantasy. And so I was very reluctant. I wrote short stories and I wrote nonfiction, and I was very reluctant to try that. And then one day I had a job working at a preschool, and I had an hour where I was supposed to sit there and watch the children sleep once a week. And I said, you know what? And there was no internet. There was no wireless.
Oh, no.
So I thought, okay, I'm gonna see how tough I am. I'm gonna try writing this story 1 hour a week. Just, try. Just see if it works. So I try it for 8 weeks. 1 hour a week. I sit there and write something. I have to read over what I did the week before. And obviously that went very slowly. And then one day I got sick. And my husband said, okay, I'll take the kids. You do whatever you want. And I thought, I wasn't terribly sick. I was just, sick enough to not want to deal with the kids. And I thought, what is it I really want to do? And I decided I really wanted to work on that story. And I started working on that story, and I couldn't stop. I wrote the first trilogy in 3 months. There are 85, 90,000 words, and I wrote the whole first draft in 3 months. It had been building up for 20 years so that it just really worked.
You had a fever, and the only solution was more story.
It was very strange. I couldn't really concentrate on anything else. My kids were kind of neglected.
Go make yourself some dinner. I'm busy.
Yeah. any of it, that's what happens when you spend 20 years developing something and then it all comes out.
And then you've had enough. Okay, they're done with the development. We're just doing this.
Yeah, I mean, just whether or not it exactly fits a genre or not. And, so far I haven't, it's very hard these days to spread something far and wide, no matter who you are, unless you're kind of famous already. But reader reaction has been really, really enthusiastic. So that is heartening to me because I wasn't sure when I started that this wasn't just some silly teenager came up with. I mean, it started as a silly teenager, but it's actually not really aimed at teenagers. And I have spoken to one group of a book club of older teens, and they did like it, but it's pretty harsh for younger teens.
Well, you've got, most people when they have a villain in their story, the villain's, pretty powerful and everything, but your villain is the most powerful person in the world, it seems.
It's not one person.
Well, it's an organization, right?
Yeah,
right.
The organization is a few hundred people who basically control everything with their circles of influence. And there is a villain, or there's 3 villains. In the first trilogy, there's one particular bad guy who's kind of is obsessed with hunting down Aranka, the main character. And so in that sense, there is a villain as well that represents a lot of what is going on. But it's a hard nut to crack when your basic big bad guy is actually an organization that pretty much does control everything.
Right. So as opposed to the bad guys trying to take over the world, they've already got it. They're just trying to keep it.
I don't know. To me, people say, how can it be dystopia if it's contemporary? I'm like, I thought you all wanted to escape from the world. The world is kind of depressing. What if I just explained? All I'm doing here is explaining a possible explanation of why the world is so depressing.
Yeah, so that's an aspect we want to look at here is, when we think dystopian, we're thinking far-flung future or near future, world is totally different, and you're saying we're going to do contemporary dystopian where the world you think is not how it is. Is that the aspect and angle you're coming at it from?
That's pretty much. I mean, the world is as depressing as you think it is, and as there's the freedom to shop, sort of, and you have your TV and your retail therapy and all these other things, but it's not really very fulfilling, and there's lots of people making money. There's people higher up who are making money off of your supposed privileges and luxuries, and then very difficult to do the things that seem like what would be reasonable and healthy. And I'm just saying, it's completely, one of the things that people say when they read the first book is, it's completely plausible. I'm walking around after I'm reading this book thinking, oh my gosh, this could really be true. As far as I know, it's not. And the black vans have not come for me yet. So
you've not been spirited away in the middle of the night.
But it's built on the basis of today's reality looks this way on the surface, but underneath it's controlled in a way that if you step out of the lines, bad things are going to happen.
Or if you happen to be unfortunate enough to get some Kirinai DNA, not just a recessive, but actually dominant in your system.
Yes. If you end up as a full-fledged Kirinai by genetic fluke, then you, whether you like it or not, you are then immune to the control of wills and emotions that is exercised by the Arie Association, and then they're going to be after you because that is a threat to them. It's the only thing that can threaten them, is there would be a strain of people out there who are immune.
Immune to their influence.
Yes.
And
not everyone is specifically controlled by the Arie. It's different from your standard mind control dystopia because nobody's acting like a robot. It's not like what's the Mind Jack series or something like that,
right.
where they're being controlled to do this and that. They are manipulated to want a certain thing, and primarily they want the benefit everything to be for the benefit of this association, and therefore they work towards that without, their actions don't have to be controlled, because what's controlled is what they desire. And most people are not even in this. Most people are just manipulated by the media manipulation and everything that we already know about.
Right. Well, they're just doing what they're told by their bosses, this is what we do. Because, I went and I read the first chapter of the first book, and they're doing medical screening of all the kids. And we find out pretty soon that they're looking for the people that have this, Kirinai DNA in them, so they can get them before they become a problem. Yes.
Yeah. This is, genetics has come far enough. Now they've realized they can actually screen these people out and get rid of the problem, because it's very important. If you're the Arie Association, you need to control a certain thing, and if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do, you have to deal with them. Best way is to control their emotions. But then you have Bernie Sanders, So then somebody comes along who you can't control. It's a big problem.
Yep. So they figured out a way to get it early.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
So yeah, that's where this is coming from, and it's based on basically pulling things together so it can look like on the surface this could be under the surface in our society. Everything that's done, the settings are all based on real places, primarily based on real places, unless it's a building that I completely constructed. But usually I even constructed the building in a place that really exists.
In a real spot. Well, you started it, your main character lives in the town you grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, I love it when I read books that are based on a place I know, and I wanted to give the people in my hometown something cool. I haven't lived there for a long time, and I could have just as well have based it where I went to school or where I live now. But it I just thought it would be cool to put something there, and it was the only part of the story I really could put there, in this out of the way backwater. But it's many fantasy stories start in a place like that. You know, you have the out of the way backwater, and from there comes the one spark of hope, the one seed of hope, for the world, and it's just chance that it comes from this particular backwater.
Have you sent them books to put up in their library?
Oh yeah. We had a big event actually last year to launch the first part of the series, and that was pretty fun because people out there are not used to having something like this based in their area. A lot of non-fantasy readers picked it up and were interested as well.
Well, you also get the dystopian readers and the thriller readers, so you got them all covered.
Hopefully. Always see it that way.
And one of the things that we were talking about earlier is you do your own herbs for herbal medicine.
Yeah.
And you brought some of that also, some of the characters in your stories a little bit. You said it's going to play even more in the second trilogy. Yeah,
there's an issue that comes up. It's not in the whole second trilogy. It's more in one of the latter books. But there's one issue that's the herbalist issue that's going to come up that's significant. There's a couple of times that herbs come up even in the first trilogy. Simply, there's a character who's an herbalist, and because the Kirinai are physiologically and biochemically different from humans, the doctor guy doesn't entirely know what to do when they have problems, because not all the regular pharmaceuticals work, and so there are some things that end up being done with herbs, basically.
Because they're an ancient race.
Yeah, they're an ancient race, and I don't necessarily want to put too many spoilers in there, but there's a way that comes up for them to have some of the knowledge of the distant past. Ooh. And part of this knowledge has to do with things about how they used herbal medicines, and they're different from the ways that we would use herbal medicine today. So it's really not, the amount of herbalist knowledge that I used to write this part was very minimal compared to what we usually, most people who know a few basic herbs would know as much as I put into there. I didn't go on it about herbalist stuff, but like Diana Gabaldon is author to read if you really want to see somebody go to town on herbalist stuff and do it well. She's categorized as romance, but I think fantasy readers would like her.
And that was part of her Outland series?
Oh, yes. Huge theme of it. Makes it very entertaining for anyone who's interested in herbs.
Excellent. Well, you also, are you able to draw, because you were a conflict correspondent, and it looks like you've been in over 30 countries that you've traveled around.
Yeah.
And were able to use a lot of that to build into your story and build your world?
Yeah, definitely that was a big part of it. I have these diverse characters that I came up with before I'd been to all those countries, which was interesting. And then I went to many of these different places, and that made it so I could really build those characters for real and make them real.
And that's very impressive. I've maybe gone 30 minutes from my house. You visited 30 countries.
30 minutes? You must have been further than that.
I've flown down to Disneyland.
Yeah.
But it takes half an hour on a plane, so 30 minutes still.
I suppose so. But yeah, that was what I was doing in my 20s, was doing journalism, and you tend to move around when you do that. And it's been very useful for this series, because if you write first person from multiple different characters, you've really got to get into the character's head. You have to make the voice stand out. Every voice has got to be different.
Right.
And so you really have to know and understand different people and different ways of thinking. And so that was a big part of why that traveling was useful. I did base a few scenes in Kosovo at one point. But Kosovo and Montenegro and the Czech Republic actually come up in the story. So So I did use a couple of international locations as well. But it has more to do, I would say, with the characters, because just about anybody could write the international scenes with some reasonable research. But it's really what I think makes the series work and sing is the characters.
Yeah, that's what makes them unique.
People don't just connect with the main character, but with several of the secondary characters as well.
And do you feel that's because you went and you made the decision to write it entirely in first person, but not just from one character's point of view? Do you think that helped make people identify more with your secondary characters?
Reviewers have said that does help. Although one of the comments that I got, when I got more in-depth comments from beta readers, they would say, I almost got more about the other characters when somebody else was first person, but it really, because it's first person and it's close first person, it's very emotionally intense, and you really get a lot of the characters. You get inside the characters' heads, and that seems very crucial to this kind of story to me.
Excellent.
The way that it's done with multiple first person, by the way, is kind of like a documentary. It's the idea of it is if they were giving testimony, informal testimony, so at some point, unspecified point after the fact. So that's how the idea of multiple first person works, is that you have a chapter from one person's perspective saying, this is what I saw, I experienced, and then you cut to another person, but you don't repeat the same thing. You go on with the story, but it happens to be part of the story where that character was in the middle of things.
So this is very much from a documentary style, which you were also involved in a documentary.
Yeah, it's documentary. It's also very conversational. It's probably more conversational than a standard documentary would be, because I really like conversational style in fiction, even when I'm a reader. But a good documentary, in my view, would be conversational. So,
excellent. And so I was looking on your website here, and it says that for people who sign up for your Hearth Circle, which is your email list, so you have your Hearthside emails, you have a free ebook for them?
Yes. And
Excellent.
If they've already read the first one, it can be one of the next ones. Doesn't have to be necessarily the first one.
So they can let you know what one they would like, and
yes,
you'll get that to them. And so what I've done for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, or if you're watching this embedded on another site, just click the little button down there that says watch on YouTube, and then you can see the description down below. I have Arie's website, and from there you'll be able to join her email list, and she promises no spam. So, which is great. And so you'll be able to get involved with her and know when her next books come out, directly from her when they come out, so that you can be apprised of the next one in the series for that. And I've also got her Facebook and Twitter down here as well. Go ahead, Arie.
It's not just announcements about when my books come out, although I do put those in there when the issue comes up. The Hearthside email circles are Hearthside email circle is where I kind of put together a kind of virtual cup of tea. It's just a little comment on something real in life that is short, and it's there if you want to read it once a week. Uh-huh. And along with it, if you don't want to read that part, you can scroll down and see the links to what I've been writing, whether it's blog entries or books or things like that. So that's what it is. So it's not from somebody else, and it's not anybody selling anything particular, but more kind of a community where there's a feeling of sitting by the hearth with a good cup of something, whether it's grog or tea.
Nice. It's not from some big evil corporation that controls the world.
No! Although, of course, being that it probably goes through Google and all that, it's well screened, I'm sure.
All right. Well, this has been an excellent, fun interview. And is there anything that you would like your readers and potential readers to know before we shut down the interview?
Just primarily, I like to talk to readers. I like to hear people's comments. I have lots of places on my website where I interact with readers, or on Facebook. I'm a really involved author in those terms. I'm not adverse at all to hitting up conversations and sharing other people's stuff. So if you want to be friends on Facebook or Twitter, that's the primary ones that I'm involved in at the moment. I'm more than happy to.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you very much, Arie, for coming on the show. Go ahead and stay here. Don't disconnect just yet. I'll close out the interview, and then I'll come back and we'll chat for a little more. But thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. So I'll be right back. All right, everyone. So that was Arie Farnam, and she's the author of the Kieran series, and it's an ongoing series. The first 3 books are a enclosed trilogy, and then continuing on with others. And definitely all the links below. I've also got the links to her Amazon page where you can see all her books there and check them out and take a look at the preview and pick up the books. So thank you very much for watching another ODNT Spotlight with me today. Again, I'm Steve DeWinter. Don't forget to subscribe. So I've got many more interviews with other authors, artists, illustrators, musicians, actors, anybody who'll come on my show. I'll have them on my show. I've got some great people lined up, and have yourself a very great day. Goodbye.